great pleasure. My name is Emanuel Pastreich, and I am the president of the Asia Institute, an independent candidate for president of the United States. I'm greatly honored today to have a chance to sit down and talk with Dan Hanley, director of 9/11 pilot whistleblowers and a leading figure in the all too critical 9/11 truth movement. Thanks, Dan, for taking the time today.
Well, thank you, Doctor. I appreciate being on the program.
So we're going to discuss what ought to be the central topic in American politics in the next presidential campaign, and basically in every aspect of our society, because 9/11 has crippled the economy, the culture, the journalism, education, and government in the United States really permanently, like breaking the back of the nation. And we also want to discuss a little bit about the nature of the 9/11 incident, and of course, why it hasn't been resolved after more than 20 years, and what needs to be done going forward to address this terrible failure. And I personally, as someone who is a professor, I guess you call an intellectual, am particularly disturbed by the silence on the part of those who really should know better to address this threat, especially since 9/11, and this will be the final point, is spilling over into what we call COVID-19, the sort of the next manifestation or variation on this disease. So let me start out, Dan, ask you, as someone who's worked on 9/11 truth for so long, about 9/11 pilot whistleblowers, what sort of an organization it is, and how you got involved.
Okay, well, first of all, let me start off by giving a little bit of my background. I flew airplanes my entire working career. I started out flying at age 19 in 1968, first as a civilian pilot, and then as a 10-year U.S. Naval aviator flying the P-3 Orion aircraft, and finally 25 years at United Airlines as a pilot. And I was forced into an early retirement in 2003 because I spoke out on issues concerning 9/11, and I fought that with the government for 6 years and lost my case. But anyhow, I currently serve as the director and international public spokesperson for a global grassroots effort, as you mentioned, 9/11 pilot whistleblowers. And we've got a website at 911pilots.org and a YouTube channel at 911 Pilots. If you want to go to those two sites, you can learn more about us, because I could devote the entire program talking about what that's all about. But anyhow, it was 2002, 2003, I started speaking out, and I was terminated in 2003 and got involved in somewhat in 9/11 truth, but it wasn't until 2006 that I first discovered this uninterruptible autopilot system. A fellow pilot told me about it. And now the purpose of our organization is to show that there were no Muslim hijackers at the controls of the 9/11 aircraft. And people say, what? They don't want to believe that you can remotely control a large commercial jet aircraft. But our purpose is to show that these aircraft were electronically hijacked and remotely controlled by this system called the uninterruptible autopilot that enables a remote source to take complete control of the aircraft autopilot and flight management computer and guide it to its target. So I've been actively involved with that, with other 9/11 truth organizations out there, and chase this thing up the chain of command politically with letter writings and phone calls. And we could talk about that a little bit later, where that led. So that's basically how I got involved in it, Doctor.
Right. Well, maybe why don't we start out with just some sort of basics. I mean, as you know, there are lots of people who are aware that the 9/11 story doesn't make any sense. In fact, anyone who took, a semester of high school physics knows it doesn't make any sense. And yet we also have a lot of bogus conspiracy stories which have been intentionally floated out there to distract and to confuse. A lot of powerful figures were involved behind the scenes. It's sort of I mean, I think the analogy I use is murder in the Orient Express. Everyone got a stab, and that makes it a little bit harder to solve. But maybe you could just very briefly say who you, based on your extensive research, who you think were like the central players, and what was their short-term and long-term motivation?
Okay, well, it depends upon your worldview and what you believe, who you believe makes the world tick. Myself personally, I believe there are much more powerful, sinister, and wealthy organizations out there. If you want to go to the 13 bloodlines of the Committee of 300, the World Economic Forum, the Bilderberg Group, the Council on Foreign Relations, the Rothschild Cabal, whatever, I believe that they actually ordered this. And I believe it was carried out by, this is my own opinion now, but it's based on reading I've done, Zionist elements of the governments of Israel, the United States, the UK, and others through collusion of the Mossad, the CIA, and MI6, and others. So you also have the military-industrial complex that stood to reap trillions in profit that was involved in the organization of this whole mess. So that's basically what I believe.
Right. Maybe I could just add as a footnote for our audience here that when we talk about, say, Mossad or CIA or Washington and Tel Aviv, now Israel, that there is a little bit of ambiguity and that there's a sort of gray area in between the two capitals, which is not really government. It's subcontractors, military contractors, private intelligence. And so they form this sort of like this space, which isn't really accountable to any country. And they make these, plot, and they work with private equity and other extremely wealthy individuals and investment firms. And finally, I would say it's not a defense of Israel, but to say, I mean, if sometimes, ironically, we find media in Israel sometimes gives more accurate reports than the United States on some issues. So the United States, I don't think it's accurate to just say it's simply Israel, that it's a sort of a cancer between the two countries.
Right. Well, I'm afraid that most people have never heard of AIPAC, AIPAC, which is the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, which is one of the strongest lobbies in Washington, D.C. And the stranglehold they have on all levels and branches of the U.S. government, including the White House and Congress, business, Hollywood, the media. And I think it's this influence that they have in this country is what led them to be able to direct the United States to do what they did. Now, I might be out to lunch on that, but that's my own personal perspective on the matter. I don't want to blame it all on Israel because each stood to gain something from 9/11.
Well, I think ultimately, I mean, obviously, until we go forward and have an international investigation and get everything out, some parts we're going to have to speculate about, not because we want to speculate, but because basically everything's covered by classified directives and secret law. We're not allowed access to. I would only want to qualify that I think, this is my personal opinion, but I think sometimes Israel has been something of a, like a pit bull, right? That if you have enough money, you can pay Israel or pay CIA to do what you want for it, and then blame Israel or blame the CIA. But there's a whole sort of hidden group behind the scenes that I think ultimately we have to go after. We're not going to solve this, not going to cure this cancer until we, get to the players behind.
Right. Well, that's those big players I was talking about, like the Rothschild Cabal, the World Economic Forum, and all the people that make the big decisions regarding the global economy and what they want the population to do. That's who I think is behind it, and that's the challenge that we have when we want to form a commission, is we're going up against the most powerful people in the world.
Well, let me ask you, I mean, the mystery for so many of us, I mean, when I saw the attacks, I remember it very vividly. My mother called me up and said something happened, and I turned on the TV immediately. And I mean, I'm not a physicist. I didn't. I studied some science through freshman year of college, but I mean, it immediately didn't make sense to me. It doesn't take a genius to figure out that this is a nonsensical story. So such an attack required collaboration and acceptance by an enormous number of people in government and the corporate world, and collaboration of academics, experts, scientists, journalists. They took bribes. They played stupid. What do you think went wrong with American society, with American culture, that made something on this scale possible?
Well, I think the biggest factor was fear. If you remember, right after 9/11, the anthrax letters that were sent out.
I remember.
I mean, Senator Leahy and Daschle got a letter because they were questioning 9/11. So I really think that that's the biggest motivator. And you talked about journalists, okay, and you got to look at the stranglehold. Again, I don't want to go back to Israel, but they do have a stranglehold on U.S. media, whether it's the mainstream media, Hollywood newspapers. And you go back to 1983, there were over 50 independent news media outlets back then. And today there's only 6 major news conglomerates that control 96% of the news we read, see, or hear. And I think it's at that same year, 1983, Israel launched the Hezbollah project, okay? And its purpose was to try to win the hearts and minds of the American people and cast a favorable light on Israel. And if you look at the organizational structure, the management structure of these 6 media conglomerates today, you'll see that they've successfully infiltrated at very high levels. And that's what, between fear and what the media and the government was able to put out to people, I think that's what actually caused. I don't think some may have taken bribes, okay, but I really think that it was fear driven by what could happen. Now you look at what happened to me in my career, and it was devastating because I lost a family and $4 million bucks, my career and everything else. There's another, you talk about academics. A good friend of mine, I live in Islamabad, Pakistan, and a good friend of mine over here in Lahore, he was a 50-year physics professor at the University of Punjab in Lahore, and the last 8 years was a vice chancellor there at the university. And he'd written several books, and one of them was 9/11 and the New World Order, which I read, and it's very informative, okay? Well, he went on a big news outlet over here and intimated that 9/11 was an inside job, and they drummed up charges. And after 50 years at this university, they canned him. So I could go on and on telling you blowback people have gotten that tried to speak out but couldn't, because there is this. I believe that the way they got away with this was highly compartmentalized factions were given access to certain aspects of this operation, and the left hand didn't know what the right hand was doing. But as far as what went wrong with American society, you got to look at what happened right after 9/11 also. Their short-term goal was to create a police state, and by that I mean NSA wiretaps, the Patriot Act, and Homeland Security, and the gutting of our Fourth Amendment right, freedom of speech right. I mean, people now are in their homes afraid that the FBI Joint Terrorist Task Force is going to kick their door down, take their hard drive, label them a domestic terrorist, and haul them off. So you have this tremendous fear of government, or this bigger system you're talking about, and that's what caused people to shut up about 9/11.
Right. Well, it's I mean, I guess it's a sort of a fear. You might say it's denial. The scale is so large that many people are overwhelmed by it. I mean, in some ways, the United States of America today is a republic in the sense that Disneyland is a republic. I mean, it looks nice on the facade, but basically it's run as a complete tyranny. And yet, we have so many people, so many educated, capable people who bought this Arabs with box cutter stories, anti-establishment figures like Noam Chomsky, who just lapped up all the mush. I mean, it really is amazing to me.
Well, you look at how the government and the media handle it. Right after 9/11, the government came out and said, no need to worry. We know who did it. We know where they were trained. We've got photos of these guys. We've got their names, and everybody lapped it up, including Noam Chomsky. Okay.
Yeah.
And I believe, just like the Oklahoma City bombing, that 9/11 was a test of the gullibility of the American people, and they passed. It turned out the couch potatoes that sit there and lap up Fox News, CNN, MSNBC, and all the other major, BBC, you name it, okay, and take the government and the media at face value what they're saying without doing their own research, deserve the police state they're sitting in. Shame on them. They should be out investigating this. It was the largest crime ever committed on American soil in U.S. history, and there's never been a criminal investigation. And the 9/11 Commission was not a criminal investigation. And you said we got to come up with a commission. I agree with you on that.
All right. Well, let's talk about that. I mean, you mentioned Oklahoma, which I have myself written about several times. I was struck at the beginning, right? That Oklahoma and 9/11, you think all the, talking heads on TV would say, oh, let's think about what the last terrorist attack, which was like this. Well, it's Oklahoma. But of course, nobody made that comparison. It was like a taboo to even compare the two, because if you started to talk about Oklahoma, then you'd have to talk about the 93 bombings of the World Trade Center. And when you draw a straight line between the 93 bombings of the World Trade Center, Oklahoma, and then 9/11, then, it's pretty self-evident.
Right, I agree. And you look at what did happen from those two incidents, it enabled the United States to pass this legislation, anti-terrorist laws.
Right.
And that started with Oklahoma City. The first laws were passed, and people got this mindset, we have domestic terrorists in this country, okay? And those laws were enhanced after 9/11 with the Patriot Act and everything else. And all this in my mind has just driven fear into the hearts and minds of Americans, and they're paralyzed, afraid to speak out.
Yes. So let's talk about, really the two of us, our whole point in this discussion here and what we've written together is to say we need a real international 9/11 commission. And after 21 years plus, that this is the time. So what do we need to do? What would be the first baby step towards having a real international 9/11 commission with teeth, with investigative power that would go forward and pull back the curtain?
Well, the first step, baby step, would be to find a location and an organization outside the United States, because I don't see it happening in the United States, not at the U.S. government level, not at the UN level. And if you look at the International Criminal Court, that's just the criminal arm of the United Nations. So I don't see getting anywhere with those three organizations. Now, in my studies,
I just put a little footnote here and say that I think the United Nations, say 20 years ago, did play some real role in international affairs and global governance, but that over the last 10 years, it's been bought up basically by billionaires. I was at a UN conference in Seoul, Korea 3 years ago with Pan Ki-moon, the previous Secretary General, and he opened his opening remarks with about 3 or 4 minute comments about Bill Gates and how much he had done to help the United Nations, and I was just disgusted.
Yeah.
So I think it's very important for people to realize that we do need some sort of international cooperation, but that the United Nations and related organizations have essentially become a sort of a playpen for the rich and powerful.
Exactly. So I live in a country with 223 million people, of which 96% are Muslim. And I've been here for 12 years, and I've seen the pain and suffering these people have had to endure due to their forced participation in Bush's farcical so-called war on terror. Okay. And I look around and say, okay, other than the 2,977 victims and their next of kin, who suffered more? What group of people suffered more than anyone in the world as a result of 9/11? And that's the Muslim community. They comprise 1.8 billion people in the world, and Islamophobia has flourished. So in my research as the director of this organization, what we did the last 18 months was go out with letters to prove to our readers and ourselves that the government was not going to do anything. It started with the Federal Aviation Administration, Secretary of Transportation, their Inspector General, all the way up the chain of command to the president. And finally, I wrote a letter to the Director General of the Pakistan's Inter Services Intelligence, and within a month, I was invited in to explain everything I knew about 9/11. So we went that route, but in the process, I discovered an organization I wasn't familiar with, and it's called the Organization of Islamic Cooperation. And it's comprised of 57 countries, and it's second only in size to the United Nations. And I've written recently to their Secretary General, imploring him to give consideration to establishing it would be called the International Islamic Commission for 9/11 Inquiry, and bring together these 57 Islamic nations, okay? Bring forth the people that we know that has all this information. And from my 18 years plus exposure to the 9/11 truth movement, I personally know the organization, who runs them, and who the individual big whistleblowers out there in the 9/11 arena. So I could go to this organization, and I've just taken the first step in this regard and say, here, we can bring you these people and these organizations, and this is the information they have. And I think getting an independent organization outside the United States that did suffer a big loss is the way to go.
Right. Well, I want to say to all our viewers, everyone who's watching this video, just how critical this is, that you, in your own way, wherever you are, even if you're working for the US government or some multinational corporation, that you can play a role in making sure this goes forward, and that we are able to actually get that international investigation going, and starting with some of, say a name, the name again of the organization you just mentioned.
Okay, it's the Organization of Islamic Cooperation. They've got
and
a
the
big
proposal for the
okay. It would be called this is just my own proposal. It would be called the International Islamic Commission for 9/11 inquiry. Okay.
Right. So this is something that all of you, everybody out there, can help in your own way to make real. So I wanted to ask a question about contemporary issues, and that is specifically, what do you think this failure, especially in the United States, but really globally? I mean, it's not like Russia or China were an exception to the buy-in on the 9/11 cover story. Basically, everyone went along at some level or not. Everyone who's a major player went along, and even not so major players. How do you feel? How do you think that failure led this failure to cut off the gangrene finger, as it were, before the poison spread? How did that tie into the current wave over the last 2 years of the COVID-19 operation? How do you see the relationship between that embrace, the embrace of the fraud back then, and what we've seen over the last 2 years?
Well, like I mentioned, I believe that 9/11 was a test of the gullibility of the American, not just the American people, the global population, really, because most bought into it, and you haven't had street riots or anybody out there with the information that is available. But I think that the COVID was another test of the gullibility of the world population.
Right.
I I personally believe there was something out there killing people, if you want to call it COVID, if it was a virus, I'm not sure. But what I refuse to believe is the death and number of cases statistics being spewed out daily by the mainstream media. And it boggles my mind that the same mainstream media and government that has perpetuated the lies of 9/11 for 20 years, people are willing to buy into it again with this COVID hysteria. And it's paralyzed the world and people walking around with masks on. And that's what I think it was, is the gullibility of the world population.
Well, I mean, I guess as someone, I mean, as an academic and someone who studied history, and I mean, intellectual history really in my own field, I originally in Asian studies, particularly Japanese studies, I also feel that it is a historical something of what we call the zeitgeist, the spirit of the age, that we're an increasingly decadent, decayed civilization, one that encourages this sort of worship of power and of symbols and signs, images, as opposed to real content, and one in which actual bravery, I mean, things like bravery or how would you say, humility, chastity, frugality, that these sort of virtues are not virtues, right? That real virtues are sort of ambition, greed, self-aggrandizement, narcissism, and that there's, I think that sort of underlying sort of corruption of our culture also fed into this process.
Right. Well, you talk about bravery, and I'm not boasting and thumping my chest and I'm a brave man for being a whistleblower. But when you step out in front of the tank and you look behind you and there's nobody who's there, it's kind of a lonely feeling. And that goes back to the whistleblower laws themselves and the stigma associated with that very title. I mean, I've been called a fink. A friend of mine that was a fired federal air marshal has been called a rat. It's a negative connotation with the word whistleblower. And when you look at, I'm sort of sidetracking on an issue here, but when you look at today's whistleblower laws, they're not worth the paper they're written on. Okay, they're designed to protect the status quo. And I worked for a couple of years back in, well, from 2006 to 12, with two groups called the National Whistleblower Center and the Government Accountability Project, which are two independent grassroots whistleblower advocacy groups. And they're the biggest ones in the world, as a matter of fact. And late in the ball game, they told me that as a federal whistleblower in the United States, you stand less than a 2% chance of winning your case, less than 2% chance. So that's, people don't want to come out and speak out because things that happened to me, I could name a whole slew of people that have had been retaliated against for speaking out. Okay, that sends a chilling signal out to other would-be whistleblowers. Keep your head down or you're going to lose it. So I talked about Dr. Cameron here. I could talk about pilots like my friend Doug Green, who refused to undergo a psychological evaluation and they fired him from United Parcel Service. I could go down a whole list of pilots, but the public are too enamored by celebrity.
Maybe I could just say for my own, in my own case, I was dismissed from my job and put on medical leave for mental illness for 2 years at the University of Illinois. And the interesting thing about it was, I mean, there are a lot of interesting things about it, but basically nobody around me, family, friends, were even willing to discuss the topic. I mean, even the sort of basic question of my right to due process was a taboo subject. I spoke with, over a period of 10 years, 5 lawyers, none of whom would even touch the case. So I'm very familiar with this process.
So until they change the whistleblower laws and make it attractive for people to come out and speak out, I don't
Right.
see things changing. And
Well, it's plenty attractive if you're looking for corruption. It's like basically in every place.
yeah, exactly. As a matter of fact, in 2006, I met a Chicago millionaire whose aluminum company had been stolen out from under him by the same bankruptcy judge, a mobbed up judge in Chicago that
Right.
presided over the United Airlines post 9/11 bankruptcy case. And for 6 years, I worked with him trying to expose these mobbed, it was actually 4 mobbed up federal and 6 state judges in Chicago. And that was my lesson. That 6-year period, I went to congressmen, senators. I was up beating on doors in Washington, D.C. I was I had my own radio program, et cetera, et cetera. None of it worked. That's when I really lost faith and trust in the U.S. government and its institutions.
Right. Well, as we like to say, there's only one party, but grab a beer because it's one hell of a party.
Yep. Yep. That's right.
Well, I thank you very much, Dan, for taking the time today.
I enjoyed talking with you, Doctor.
And we both want to just reach out to everyone who might be watching there and say, please join us. Let's make this both within the United States and globally into a demand for truth, for scientific truth, and the implications thereof, because the consequences of allowing all systems, whether it's media, journalism, or academics, scholarship, government, science to be corrupted, is going to be catastrophic for humanity.
I agree with you 100%.
Thank you again.
Okay, thank you, and take care, Doctor. Bye-bye.